to our seminar, SIGA seminar, this afternoon. My name is Sami Al-Aryan, the Director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs here at Istanbul Zaim University. It's my pleasure to introduce to you today our speaker, who is a distinguished friend and who has come to us specifically to address us this afternoon. Miko Peled is a writer and human rights activist born and raised in Jerusalem. He is considered by many to be one of the clearest voices calling for justice in Palestine. Support of the Palestinian call for boycott, divest, and sanctions movement, BDS, and the creation of a single democracy with equal rights on all of historic Palestine. Driven by a personal family tragedy to explore Palestine, its people, and their narrative, has written a book about his journey called The General's Son. If you haven't read it, I certainly advise you to do so. The title is The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. Many famous people have praised the book, including Ralph Nader, Seymour Hersh, Naomi Wolf, and others. The book covers the work in which Miko's family has been involved since his grandparents immigrated to Palestine in the early 20th century as part of the Zionist project, describing their work and their life in detail. Miko's paternal grandfather was a singer on the Israeli Declaration of Independence. His father was a general in the Israeli army. In the 1970s, his father pioneered the Israeli-Palestinian dialogue, eventually meeting with Yasser Arafat. Miko has also just completed a second book, Injustice, the story of the Holy Land Foundation 5. The book describes the persecution and the closure of what was America's largest Muslim charity organization, the Holy Land Foundation, and the subsequent trials and convictions of the 5 Palestinian American Muslims. Again, many people praised the book, including me. I said about it, actually, Injustice is a must-read book for anyone who wants to know how after 9/11, the U.S. criminal justice system has been undermined and become another tool utilized by the pro-Israeli camp to silence and intimidate Palestinian Americans. Peled thoroughly presents the decade-long campaign to criminalize the giving of humanitarian aid to other Palestinians living in poor communities and squalid refugee camps, and how the U.S. government has failed to uphold its ideals as these men came to the U.S. for freedom, only to be ultimately denied that freedom. Miko was educated in Jerusalem, Japan, and the United States. He's an also accomplished professional martial artist. I didn't know that until I read this. He holds a 6th-degree black belt in karate. Now, he sold his school that he used to run, which also taught leadership skills, nonviolent conflict resolution, and now he's dedicated full-time to writing, speaking, and activism focused on transforming the racist Zionist regime in Palestine into a democracy with equal rights. Please welcome Miko Peled.
Thank you, Dr. Sami, for your friendship and for your very kind introduction. I almost didn't make it, so I'm glad I'm here. I'm glad I made it with the weather and everything. I flew in this morning. And first of all, I can say Assalamu alaikum. I'm assuming that many people here are fasting now, right? Yes. Well, one interesting experience, has nothing to do with my lecture, but one interesting experience that I had with Ramadan and fasting, when I was still teaching martial arts, I was in Ramallah, and I have a friend in Ramallah who was a Palestinian friend who has a very beautiful karate school. It's a very beautiful, very serious karate school. And one summer I was there, and he asked me to come, and I taught, and we taught together, and many students there. Many of them were young, many of them were children. And summer in Ramallah, it was very, very hot. suddenly I realized it was Ramadan. And I thought, all these kids, they're all sweating and they're working so hard. So I asked him, I said, is anybody fasting? And some of these kids were very young, and everybody's hands went up. And I was there with my son, he came with me as well. And we're both looking at each other and just this amazement that all of these young kids, I mean, they didn't even skip a beat, they didn't slow down, they didn't, it's not like they were showing that they were suffering, they were like full of energy, no problem whatsoever. I thought in America you're not going to find kids like that, so willing to work that hard and no water, no nothing. And it was inspiring to see them work so hard and not care at all about the fact that they were not going to drink any water until many hours later. So this is what I do. I talk about Palestine, I write about Palestine, and when you deal with Palestine, as I'm sure many of you, is anybody here from Palestine? Oh, better if you're okay. Anybody here visit Palestine? That's not from Palestine. When you, and by the way, I have a few copies of my books that Dr. Said mentioned, so when you deal with Palestine, there's always something burning. There's always a big issue. There's always something that's either going on or just ended. There's always, we're just, some attack is upon us, or some attack just happened, or some attack is just taking place. Maybe it's in Gaza, maybe it's in Jerusalem, maybe it's other places. And so you sometimes wonder, well, so what is the most burning issue right now? And over the last few months, I've been paying closer attention to what is happening in Jerusalem. And I was born and raised in Jerusalem. And it seems to me that the speed and the efficiency with which the state of Israel is moving forward in Jerusalem makes it perhaps, at this moment, the most burning issue. Because if something doesn't happen soon, the Jerusalem that many of us know, this ancient, beautiful Arab Muslim city, will be gone as that city, and will be replaced by something else. The speed with which not only the names are being changed, but archaeological monuments are being allowed to be destroyed, and the history being erased is at such speed that it's really alarming. And if something isn't done very, very soon, we will find ourselves with the loss of this great heritage and this great city. So that's why I decided I would talk about that today. And one of the most endearing stories that I've ever heard about Jerusalem, and it may or may not be true, when the Caliph Omar came to Jerusalem. And you may have heard the story, and again, there's several versions, so I don't know how true it is, but it's a very beautiful story, so I'll mention it now. When he came to Jerusalem, he was looking for the place where the temple used to be, and nobody could tell him where it was. And so at one point, there was an old Jewish beggar. A Jewish beggar told the Khalifa he knows where, and he can take him to see where the temple used to be, and it used to be where the trash dump, the main city trash dump was. And the beggar and the Khalifa went down on their hands and knees and cleaned it with their hands and cleaned the trash and found the place where the temple used to be, and that the sanctuary that was built there that we see today, the beautiful Golden Dome, was created so that would never happen again. So that beautiful and important and holy spot would always be cherished and remembered. I think that speaks to the shared values when it comes to Jerusalem, when it comes to Jews and Arabs, as opposed to what is happening today when Zionists have taken over and have destroyed that. And another interesting thing that many people don't know, about more than 100 years ago, in the year 1900, and when Zionism was just beginning to develop, just beginning, the people were just beginning to recognize and to understand what Zionism was about, all the major rabbis around the world came out and published a book. And in this book, they had written all their opinions. They published their opinions. And this is, 1900s, a very long time ago. And this is before World War II, so there were very large Jewish communities. And these rabbis were representing Jewish communities from Europe, from North Africa, from Yemen, from Palestine. And these rabbis came out. I read the book. It's very interesting. It was published in Hebrew, which is unique because they didn't use Hebrew to speak and to publish. And in this book, they explain why they explain why Zionism is so dangerous, or the dangers that that Zionism presents. And they said several things that were really quite prophetic. They said, first of all, it's going to bring violence to the Holy Land. Zionism will bring violence to the Holy Land. And then they said the creation of the so-called Jewish state in Palestine will put Jews around the world in a difficult position because people will question their loyalty. Are they loyal to the countries where they live around the world, or are they loyal to this new Jewish state? And they said it will ruin the good relations that exist between Jews and Muslims around the world, in the Arab world, and Jews and Arabs in Palestine. And mind you, this was in 1900. Zionism was very small. There were not that many Zionists around. But they already understood that the dangers that this presents and what this will mean for the relationship between Muslims and Jews that were historically very, very good. And again, as we look at the reality today in Palestine, it's I think there's cause for a great deal of concern. Now, like you heard, I was born in Jerusalem, but I was born in West Jerusalem. And there's a piece of the history of Jerusalem, again, that many people, I think, how much of they realize. But in 1948, or at the end of 1947, when the United Nations partitioned Palestine, Jerusalem was not part of any state. It was its own sovereign entity. Israel ignored that, of course, and throughout 1948, it conquered Palestine, began to colonize it, executed a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing, and in the western part of Jerusalem, the ethnic cleansing campaign was 100% successful. No Palestinians were allowed to remain. Not one family, not one Palestinian remained in West Jerusalem. So the Jerusalem that I was born and raised in, which is West Jerusalem, I didn't even know there used to be Palestinians there growing up. And I'm sure today Israelis that live there have no idea that Palestinians used to be there, except, and this is one of these one of these contradictions that is very characteristic to Israelis and to Zionist thinking. There are entire neighborhoods in West Jerusalem that are Arab neighborhoods, or there were Arab neighborhoods, and they have these beautiful Arab homes. And they're referred to as Arab homes because they're very distinct. The Jerusalemite families in Palestine built very beautiful homes. And the homes were not destroyed, and of course, people live there now. Israelis live there. So even though they're called Arab homes, and even though these neighborhoods were distinctly Arab, nobody wonders, where did the Arabs go? How come there are no Arabs here? How come there are no Palestinians at all in West Jerusalem? And this is also why none of the countries that recognize and have relations with Israel opened embassies in Jerusalem, because the taking of the occupation of West Jerusalem was completely in violation of international law and in violation of the United Nations partition plan. And then, of course, in 1967, Israel completed the conquest of Jerusalem, took East Jerusalem, and now over the last some 50-odd years, it's an ongoing campaign of what they call Judaizing, or Israelizing East Jerusalem, which means taking over more land, taking over more neighborhoods. It's much more difficult in East Jerusalem. But they are pushing Palestinians out, and creating settlements for Israeli Jews only. And what's interesting is that also that they like to call Jerusalem a mixed city. Now, I grew up in Jerusalem. There's nothing mixed about Jerusalem. It's completely segregated. It's probably one of the most racist and most segregated cities in the world. And you'd think if it was a mixed city, then maybe they would bring kids together for sporting events, bring the Israelis and the Palestinians together to do things to show that that city is mixed. But there's nothing whatsoever, quite the opposite. The schools are separated. The neighborhoods are certainly separated. And from every other perspective, any other angle that we look at it, the city, the people within the city, the segregation is absolute. And even though, again, it's only one city, and quite frankly, you're never more than 5 minutes away from a Palestinian neighborhood, there is absolutely no connection between the two sides, between Palestinians and Israelis. And I remember when I was in, I don't know, 6th grade or 7th grade, we heard about this thing that they were going to do, which was called integration. And we thought, whoa, what is this thing? It's this big word called integration. So the integration that they had planned and they had executed during those couple of years was they brought the children of Jewish families that came from the Arab countries, it's what they call Mizrahi or Sephardic Jews, because they went to different schools. Because there was even segregation between Jewish kids who came from families or European families and the Jewish kids who came from Arab families. We had the better schools, of course, because we were European and we were white, of course, and so on. So we were more privileged, we were the better schools. And their school was not, just a few blocks away. And it was a massive operation, it was a big deal. Like I said, they gave it a name, integration. And they brought those kids, basically brown Jewish Israeli kids, to our school. And that was the integration. And we were not even in the same classes. We were in separate classes. And we had the better teachers because being Europeans, we were going to be leaders and professors and politicians and everything. And they were just going to be, laborers or who knows what. That sort of
we
thing.
just had lunch together.
So we didn't even have lunch together. We didn't even have lunch together. We never did that. We were separate groups within the school. It took many years before groups began to actually work in the same classrooms and play together and so on and interact. It took many years. So that was the level of racism. So you can imagine bringing in Palestinian kids with Israeli kids. That's outrageous. Even today, nobody would even suggest that. That's how deeply rooted and seated the racism. And it's true all over Palestine, but in Jerusalem it's particularly troubling, especially since they like to call it, a mixed city. Now, the way the Israeli occupation of Palestine has worked over, if we look at the last 7 decades, typically you have these groups of young Zionists who go out there and push Palestinians out, take over Palestinian land, kick Palestinians out of their villages, destroy, commit a massacre, and so on. And then somehow the mainstream Zionist government, the mainstream Zionist institutions, at first they kind of distance themselves from it. Or maybe they'll say it was some kind of a prank. Maybe they'll say it was something, it was just a bunch of irresponsible, young people who are a little more zealot or a little more extreme, but it really does not represent us. This was true as early as Zionism began to take over Palestine. It became a little more extreme after 1967 because the groups after 1967 were these new kind of Zionists who were religious Zionists. Because originally the Zionists were secular. After 1967, this new group of zealot Zionists emerged, and these were the religious Zionists. These are the settlers that we see today, mostly in the West Bank and in the old city of Jerusalem and in Hebron, in the old city of Hebron. It's a new kind of zealot religious nationalism. And at first, of course, they would go to somewhere like Hebron, the old city of Hebron, and take over places and other villages and towns within the West Bank. And the state always distanced itself from them, but then they would have to supply them with electricity and water because they're sitting there, in these places, so they supply them with electricity and water. then they'd have to supply them with security, because these poor Jews are in the midst of all these angry Arabs. So we can't just leave them there. We have to send the military to protect them. And then before you know it, they have their own little settlement. And little by little by little, these little settlements grow, and then they become towns, and they become cities. And before you know it, you have all these cities and towns all over parts of Palestine where supposedly they were not supposed to be. Where supposedly the state had no intention of going, but now that they're there, well, what are you going to do? And this is something that goes on all the time. It happens all the time, all over Palestine, and again, it's particularly extreme in the West Bank and in the old city of Jerusalem and the old city of Hebron. But this is the process, and this is how it's going. And what's been happening over the last, in Jerusalem, particularly in the old city of Jerusalem over the last several decades, is the exact same thing. Whether it's pushing Palestinians out of the Muslim quarter, whether it's not pushing Palestinians out yet, but pushing their presence onto the Haram al-Sharif, the holy sanctuary, which, interestingly enough, Jews, according to Jewish law, are prohibited from entering. But these are different kind of Orthodox Jews. These are Orthodox Jews that have blended in or mixed in to their Orthodoxy. They mixed in Zionism and nationalism, which of course makes it very, very toxic, very poisonous. And you see this process going on a regular basis, and you have to wonder: are these just small minority of fanatics, or is this something that's growing? And what's become obvious is that this group that I used to think were just a bunch of fanatics that were negligible, are growing and growing in numbers. And in an interview that was given recently by Yehuda Glick, who was one of these very radical members of the Israeli Knesset, whose really life's mission is to push Palestinians and Muslims out of the holy sanctuary and build a temple there, build a Jewish temple instead of the mosque that exists there today and the sanctuary that exists there today. He admitted when he started, was a young man 34 years ago, there were maybe a few dozen Jews who dared to enter the sanctuary, the Haram al-Sharif. They would come in and instigate a little bit, and they'd be arrested, but it was a small group. Last year, they had over 30,000 Israeli Jews enter, not as tourists, not to come and see it respectfully, but in order to instigate, in order to come in and present themselves as the new masters of the land. And they have tours. And in these tours, it is absolutely clear that these are not tours to view the place. These are tours that are designed in order to show a presence and to show a powerful presence, to say, we are here. And so far, based on what they've been doing this year, they're expecting over 50,000 Israeli Jews of that sort will go in and do the same thing. And you can see the videos there of these groups on YouTube, and you can see them on here if you follow their social media, which I do. It's very, very troubling, because these are enormous numbers. And their intent is absolutely clear. In other words, their intent is not something that they're hiding. To destroy what exists today in the Holy Sanctuary in Jerusalem. And to them, this beautiful monument, this icon of Jerusalem, which is the Golden Dome, is exactly what they want to get rid of. And instead, they want to build a Jewish temple. And again, I used to hear about these people all the time. I think, yeah, this is complete nonsense. These are crazy people. And actually, about a year ago, I met a distant cousin of mine, who's a very religious Jew, and she was telling me how she participates in this national service program where they practice the building of the temple, and they teach young children how how we're supposed to operate once the temple is built, and how you do the sacrifices and all the rituals and so forth. And it's troubling to hear somebody like that talk, but what's even more troubling that this is a state-sponsored program. This is considered national service. It's a state-sponsored program. So the state of Israel is paying for these programs. And you can see them periodically right outside of the old city, or within the old city, but just below Al-Aqsa Mosque, practicing these rituals. And dressed like the priests and everybody used to be dressed 2,000 years ago, and doing all of this. And the numbers that come to participate grow with every holiday, with every Passover, with every year, they grow and grow and grow. And again, the idea is absolutely to instigate. The idea is to be there and provoke. The idea is to be there and intimidate, because of course they have the military behind them, they have the police behind them. And when Palestinians respond, then the Palestinians get shot, or the Palestinians get arrested. And whereas, like I said, and I can't say this enough, in the past it seemed like these people were really just a bunch of irrational zealots. It is absolutely clear that today they're doing the same work that these zealots used to have been doing for over 70 years now in Palestine, but they have the full support and the full backing of Israeli politicians. And of course that means that, like I said, the army, the police, and everybody's behind them. And unless something serious happens to intervene, they will be successful, just like they've been successful in other places in Palestine. And that should be a great concern, I think, to everybody, regardless of our religion. There was a documentary done about them by the Israeli television recently, and in this documentary, one of the things that comes out is, first of all, many of the people who are involved with this are not even religious Orthodox Jews. And again, these are not the Orthodox Jews that we know historically that have existed in Palestine and Jerusalem and other places. This is the new type of Orthodox Jews that mix nationalism and Zionism into their life. But there are also completely secular people, perfectly secular Israeli Zionists who, typically Zionists were always secular, who are also getting involved in this. And one of the people that was interviewed in this documentary, and again, this is by Israeli TV, so this is all in Hebrew, is an architect. And this architect has been working with these groups. Some of them are called Returning to the Mount. Another group is called the Temple Mount Faithful. There are several groups, but they're basically the same people, and it's quite fascinating actually to follow them on social media. And they've been working with this architect and paying him a lot of money in order to build this new Jerusalem, in order to build the temple, in order to create these new structures in the old city of Jerusalem that will turn it into this messianic, Jewish something or other, whatever it is they imagine it to be, which will focus on the temple as they envision, as they imagine it should be. And it's quite disturbing because a lot of these people live in the old city, or in areas around, strategic areas around the old city where they see the dome, or where they see the golden dome, and their objective is absolutely to see it disappear one day. And this architect was asked about this, and he said, well, they have this plan to expand Jerusalem to include Ramallah in the north and all the way to Bethlehem in the south. And there are millions of Palestinians living in these areas. And he was asked, so what about Palestinians who live here? And because, well, as far as the Arabs are concerned, they'll have choices, they'll be able to get some compensation and leave. Or they will be able to convert. Or if they agree to be loyal to this Jewish project, then of course they can stay. And nobody asked the questions, well, what if they don't want any of these choices? And what about the fact that this city has been a continuously and constantly Arab and Muslim city for over 1,000 years? I mean, nobody asks these questions. And again, it would be extremely important to bring that up in the context of an Israeli television program, because Israelis don't know this, Israelis forget this, Israelis don't learn this. When the Israelis learn the history of Palestine, they learn it as what is presented by the Zionist biblical narrative. So there used to be this magnificent kingdom of Israel until the Romans came and destroyed it, and then there was 1948. And then the 2,000 years in between, all these people came and went, but none of them were actually part of the land. None of their histories are important. None of what they did is of any significance whatsoever. But of course, in that particular interview, that question was not asked. You know, the idea is that it's okay to, it's part of the Israeli narrative that it's okay to assume that we can just present the Arabs with all these choices, and they can pick one or two of them, or they can all just leave because they can go to all these other Arab countries. And this is a very common narrative. This is a very common discourse in Israel. It's not something that's unique to a small group. Talk about kicking people out, getting rid of people, replacing existing towns and cities and monuments with new ones because we have a right, because we were there 2,000 years ago, is completely common. It's something that you hear, and you hear people talk about all the time, whether they're religious or secular. It makes absolutely no difference. And that, again, is very, very troubling. In fact, he coined a term. He said one of the options we're going to give the Arabs is evacuation compensation. Evacuation compensation. In other words, we're going to get rid of them, but we'll compensate them. And if they choose to stay, they will have to be loyal to this project. I don't know if anybody of you heard of this new book that came out by Nur Masalha called Palestine, the 4,000-Year History. But it's very relevant, and I think it's a really important book for everybody to read. I just started reading it, and I met him. I was in London. I just met him. And besides the fact that he takes the narrative, this biblical Zionist narrative, and very scientifically and very properly throws it out the window, as it should be done, he brings in very clear proof, for example, that the name Palestine, or versions of the name Palestine, have been used for that country for almost 4,000 years. And that the whole episode of Israel, Judea, may have existed, but if it did, for no more than maybe 200 or 300 years within that 4,000-year period. And then he talks about the cities, and he talks about Islam, and he talks about all these other different things. And everything he talks about is historically proven. It's scientifically shown. It's he uses archaeology and he uses documents that were used by the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Egyptians and so forth to substantiate his case and so forth. And this is exactly the part of the story, part of the narrative that's missing when we talk about Palestine. And again, it's particularly important right now, I think, particularly missing when we talk about Jerusalem. Because as this, and I've seen over the years, I've seen many examples of this method of work by the Zionists, where a small group takes over a piece of land, and a few years later you have a city, and you have a perfectly legitimate settlement. Even though, when some of these places, they used to say that they're so remote, because when the Palestinians were there are still Palestinians that don't get electricity and water, because they live in all these very remote places, so the electricity and the water doesn't reach, and there are no roads. Even inside 1948 Palestine, in the Negev Desert, we see Palestinian communities that have no roads, and have no water, and have no electricity. These are Israeli citizens. But somehow, as soon as Jewish settlers show up, the electricity is there, the water somehow manages to make it all the way to these remote areas. The military shows up because they need security, And, you know, within a couple of years, you have a perfectly legitimate town, city, farm, whatever it is that they chose to do in that land. And this is exactly what is happening in Jerusalem now. Now, in the bigger context, as we see the unfolding of the deal of the century, when we look back a couple of years at the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital city of Israel, that is a very serious red flag. That is legitimizing not only what was done, not only the ethnic cleansing campaign that was completed and was completely successful in 1948 in West Jerusalem, but the ongoing ethnic cleansing of Jerusalem that is happening now in the eastern part of the city. And everything that we see in between, the pushing out of Palestinians from the old city, the taking over of homes and streets and alleyways within the Muslim quarter. And again, this desire to squeeze Palestinians and squeeze Muslims out of the most holy parts of the city, of course, the holy sanctuary. This is I think, is an incredibly alarming sign, because it legitimizes everything that Israel does, or everything that Israel has done up to this point, and it really gives legitimacy to Israel to do whatever that they want from this point on. That's what that was. And of course, it was reckless. It was a violation of international law. It was a violation of United Nations resolutions. It was the legitimizing of horrific crimes against humanity, crimes against war crimes, and all of this. And I'm only talking about the Jerusalem part of this. But the legitimacy that Israel has now to continue to do this, and of course, because the United States led the way with opening the embassy there and recognizing Jerusalem as the capital city of Israel, now all these other countries are expected to do the same. So if we don't all stand up and do something about this and start talking about Palestine in a more clear way, start talking about Jerusalem in a more clear way, reclaiming and not taking for granted the fact that this is an ancient Arab and Muslim city, then it will be lost. We need to start imagining a day where we will not see the Golden Dome in the old city of Jerusalem. We need to have that in our mind, because if we don't, I don't think we're going to do anything. We're going to understand how severe this is. Now, I'm a firm believer that the reality in Palestine today is so severe that plain solidarity is not enough. Plain days of solidarity are behind us. The days where we can walk around with Free Palestine T-shirts and call out Free Palestine and assume that something is going to happen as a result of that are way beyond us, are way behind us. We all have to participate one way or the other in the Palestinian resistance. Now, that doesn't mean we all need to buy guns and start, doing that. But Palestinians have provided us, all of us, with a gift. And that gift is BDS. I think the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and I usually actually wear those, I just forgot to put it on. I usually wear them before I start my lectures. The Palestinian call, the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions is a gift to the rest of the world, to people of conscience everywhere, to say, here is what needs to be done. Here is what we need you to do. And it's something that is so simple. It's something that we can all take part of. Boycotting is something very easy to do. Imposing sanctions, divesting is maybe a little bit more difficult if we're talking about individuals. But boycotting is certainly a right and is very easy to do. Now, because this call is so important, because the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions is legitimate, because over the last, it's been almost 15 years since the call was made, there has been incredible progress by the BDS movement. The state of Israel is in a state of panic. The state of Israel is in a state of panic. If they could take out the three letters B, D, and S from every word and from every sentence, they would take them out. from the entire alphabet. And they have a government ministry that deals with fighting the BDS. They've had conferences on how to defeat the BDS. They've had interviews and they've had TV programs and articles after articles after articles written in the Israeli papers, and whole different programs in the different news channels in Israel have had programs about the BDS, understanding it, analyzing it, talking to me. They've interviewed me a couple times even. And so it's something that's troubling them because it cannot be killed, it cannot be destroyed. It's grassroots, it's effective, and it's the right thing to do. Now, people still argue about this, whether they're within Palestine, whether they're outside of Palestine, whether they're supporters of Israel, whether they're supporters of Palestine. And I think it's very easy to set the record straight about what BDS is about. It's very, very easy. All we have to do is look at what the demands of this call for. The demands, when we look at the demands that were set by the Palestinians, I don't think we could find more reasonable, remedial demands ever made by a national liberation movement. There's no call to kill anyone, there's no call to destroy anything, there's no call to kick anybody out. It's about three very simple, very basic, very common sense and remedial actions that need to take place. And by the way, on all three there's already a consensus, an international consensus. The ending of the military occupation in parts of Palestine where there's still a military occupation. Equal rights between Palestinians and Israelis. And the Palestinian refugee return to their homes and their land. How can anybody say that there's anything wrong, that there's anything but reasonable within these demands? But, like I said, Israel is panicking, so it has all of its agents around the world, senators in the United States, in the Senate, in the Congress, governors, and its agents around the states, both in Europe and in the different states within the United States, trying to pass laws to delegitimize it, to make it illegal, to say that it's anti-Semitic. It's a new form of anti-Semitism. It's kind of a secret kind of anti-Semitism. It's a little more sophisticated because. And where's the anti-Semitism? I look and I can't find it. I read these three demands over and over and over again. I don't know where there's any anti-Semitism. But I do know that the call for BDS and the demands represent justice, freedom, and equality. And if anybody thinks that those three are anti-Semitic, then they have a serious problem. Because I don't think the call for justice, freedom, and equality are somehow are not compatible with Jewish law, with Judaism. But that's the insanity of the conversation. It goes into all these different directions, and suddenly we find ourselves with a Palestine that has been occupied for 71 years, with 5 million Palestinians who are languishing in refugee camps. And by the way, part of the deal of the century was, if you haven't noticed, the fact that America stopped giving money to UNRWA, to the United Nations agency that deals with the refugees, is basically saying there are no refugees. There's no such thing as refugees. The only refugees that exist are the ones that were there in 1948 and were actually pushed out. Everybody else is not considered a refugee. So that's also part of this deal of the century. So Jerusalem was taken away. The refugees have been taken away. And the third, major issue that they always talk about as a kind of final status issue is borders, and they're going to resolve the border issue very soon when Israel declares sovereignty over Judea and Samaria, which is basically all of the West Bank without the Palestinian population. So they'll keep these little Bantustans of Palestinian, or they don't call them Palestinians. When you look at the website of some of the towns and some of the bureaucracies within the West Bank. And by the way, Israel has stopped using the term West Bank for a very long time ago. It's all Judea and Samaria. The military command there is called the Command of Judea and Samaria. The police force is called the Police Force of Judea and Samaria. all the bureaucracies, the cities and towns, the counties, it's all within Judea and Samaria. There's no such thing as West Bank. The roads, the main highways, if you drive along the highways, they take you to cities and towns. Nothing there about being in the West Bank. And what you see is they talk about the fact that it's flourishing and all these wonderful settlements are coming up and how happy everybody is and how beautiful the landscape is and how wonderful the homes are and the communities, and there's a home for everybody. But of course we realize that there's also what they call a problematic population within these areas, and therefore that presents some challenges. But our security forces know how to deal with them. That's the Palestinians. And that's exactly how this deal of the century is going to deal with the borders. If anybody has any doubt, I think the recognition of Israeli sovereignty on the Golan Heights is a prelude to recognizing Israeli sovereignty over Judea and Samaria. So while we're arguing on our side whether the BDS is anti-Semitic or not anti-Semitic, they are getting things done. Now, the good thing is, I think, that America cannot give Israel Jerusalem. They can recognize its sovereignty, they can open an embassy, they can do whatever they want, but that's not going to change the fact that Jerusalem has been a marvel of Arab and Muslim history for over 1,000 years. The most iconic symbol of Jerusalem, even when Israel chose Jerusalem in its own pictures and its own, material for tourism, they show the Golden Dome because it is one of the most beautiful monuments in the world because it is so iconic. So it's there, and nobody can take that away. The fact that this is what Jerusalem is. Nobody can take away the fact that Palestine has been Palestine and has been called Palestine since the Bronze Age. You've probably heard that there's this ridiculous argument that there are no such thing as Palestinians because there's no P in Arabic. You heard that?
Yeah.
If you haven't heard it, it's been going on for a while, and it became very famous when Netanyahu was the prime minister. His son tweeted it. And he said, to all you idiots and all you morons that talk about Palestine, it can't be a Palestine because there's no P in Arabic. P is stupid. So what I pointed out was that there's no J in Hebrew, so that means there's no such thing as Jews. If that we follow the same logic, then since there's no J in Hebrew, then that takes away all the arguments about Jews and Judaism and Judea and all that. But that's really the nonsense. At the end of the day, like I said, if we all don't act in a way that is strategic and fierce and dedicated, then all of these successes by all these different groups, whether they used to seem extreme yesterday and today they're mainstream, whether they used to be considered just a bunch of gangs, settler gangs 20 years ago, today they are in the coalition, in the government, they are Netanyahu's coalition partners, because ideologically there's no difference between them. Only he wears a suit and they don't. That's the only difference. So unless we act, their successes are going to continue. Almost every single day, another home in the old city of Jerusalem in the Muslim quarter is being taken by settlers. I don't know if you've heard of the community called Silwan, which is just outside of the old city of Jerusalem. It's a community of some 50,000 Palestinians. And someone decided that the true city of David lies under those homes in Silwan. So every single day, and you can walk there in broad daylight, and you see the digging, archaeological digging going on under the homes, ruining the foundations of the homes being destroyed, and the people being forced to leave. As Israeli settlers, Jewish settlers take over, and suddenly the home has a flag, an Israeli flag, and a post for a soldier, not a soldier, they have their own little paramilitary guards, and that's it. The Palestinians are leaving, and the settlers are coming in. And there's already an archaeological park, maybe you've heard of it, it's called the City of David. It's an archaeological park where supposedly you'll be able to walk around and see what it was like during the days of King David, which, by the way, there's no historical proof ever existed. And it's almost certain that he probably didn't. It's a kind of mythology that was created many hundreds of years after the fact. So this is happening, and they're doing this very fast, and they've got a lot of money, and it's really a cause for great concern. And I don't think there's any question that the issue of Jerusalem is one that is near and dear to the heart of all Arabs and Muslims, regarding not only the Palestinians, but certainly on the issue of Palestine, this is a key issue. And so what do we do? Like I said, I believe that being engaged on the issue of boycott, divestment, and sanctions is crucial. I remember when I was here in Istanbul shortly after Trump declared that he's moving the American embassy to Jerusalem, and then there's a big conference of all Muslim countries to denounce that, to take care of that, which is a very good step. Now there needs to be more steps. Now there needs to be more action. This is something that we can all participate in. And boycotting, sanctioning, imposing, divesting from Israel is crucial. It's the one thing that we know works, and it's the one thing that we know that scares Israel the most. And I think that looking back at the 4,000-year history of Palestine, and knowing that it was Palestine, and that the name Palestine was part of that, was what the name that was used for this country, I think we need to be able to envision a future. So what is the future of Palestine? When we say a free Palestine, what are we talking about? What does it look like? And I think that's extremely important too. People usually talk about Israel, Palestine, Palestine, Israel, Israel, Palestine, Palestine, Israel. I think it's time to forget the name Israel and leave it out of the equation completely. Because if we accept the name Israel, then we're accepting and we're legitimizing what has taken place over the last 71 years. Palestine was called Palestine for about 4,000 years until 1948. Suddenly it became Israel. What happened? If we accept the name Israel, if we use the name Israel, then we're accepting that what was happened in 1948 and goes on until today is legitimate. So we accept it. Otherwise, why would we call it Israel? And some people, I think, are either afraid or confused, and so they use both names. People say, oh, I visited Palestine and I visited Israel. What does that mean? You either recognize that this country is Palestine, that it's been occupied for 71 years, that it's a brutal occupation that needs to end, that there's an entity which is a racist entity which can only be described as an apartheid regime that's been in place for 71 years and needs to go, along with the name, or you accept it. So we have to make a decision, and the way we use the name we use to describe this country reflects what we think of what is happening today. So if we say Israel-Palestine, that means we accept that there's a legitimacy, that there's a right to this thing called Israel to exist. And that's a choice that each and every one of us has to make. But I think, and I usually invite people to put aside the name Israel, call Palestine by the name that the people of Palestine call it, which is Palestine. Whether you talk to Palestinians in the Negev Desert, or in the Galilee, or in Jerusalem, or in Jaffa, or in Haifa, or in Hebron, or Jerusalem, anywhere else, they call it Palestine. And that's exactly what we need to be doing, or certainly the Palestinians in refugee camps call it Palestine. So again, that is part of the struggle. Recognizing what exists there today, what's been happening today, and then expressing it clearly by not using the name Israel. By not being afraid to say, this is illegitimate, we do not recognize this. This regime does not have a right to exist. It has nothing to do with killing anybody or kicking anybody out. That's the argument that comes from the other side. Well, if you don't accept the right of Israel to exist, then you want to kill everyone, then you're like, I don't know what, you want another Holocaust? Nobody's talking about that. The fact that there are people there are people there. The landscape has changed, like there are white people in South Africa. They're not indigenous, but they're there now. They're the result of hundreds of years of colonization and racism. Well, people like myself, we're the same thing. We're like the whites in South Africa. Israeli Jews are like the whites in South Africa. But now that's the reality. So they'll need to accept this as well. But again, I think it's extremely, extremely important that people who believe in Palestine call the country Palestine. People who believe in Palestine fight for Palestine. And again, I don't mean picking up a gun necessarily. I mean picking up a PDS badge and then promoting this idea and talking to people about not purchasing things from Israel, about not making deals with Israel, about not traveling, on El Al, or if you go to visit Palestine, not Israel, that sort of thing. And that carries a lot of weight. That carries a great deal of weight. I think that's incredibly important. And again, I'll say what I said in the beginning. If we don't act swiftly, then the successes by Israel will only continue and will continue to grow. And I know now for sure, because again, if you asked me a few years ago, I would say this whole Jerusalem thing, this whole, destroying Aqsa and building a temple thing was some fringe, unimportant group. Today, I don't think so at all. They are funded, they are protected, they're growing in numbers. They're not only a fringe group of some, religious zealots. This is becoming more and more mainstream, this notion, this idea that we all actually want to see the day when the Jewish temple is rebuilt and so forth, which of course is an insane idea, absolutely insane idea. And even if you talk to the most Orthodox religious Jews, the real Orthodox religious Jews, not the Zionist ones, they will all agree that it is absolutely unacceptable, crazy idea to go and destroy Jerusalem, to destroy the Muslim monuments, to destroy the Arab monuments of Jerusalem. They will agree to that as well. So it's not a religious thing, it's not an Orthodox or secular thing at all. And then believe that it can be done. I think it's crucial to believe that Palestine, from the river to the sea, from the Lebanese border all the way to the Negev Desert, all the way to the very south, is all Palestine and should all be free. That means no racist laws and no apartheid regime and no checkpoints and no privileges to people who are like me, but complete and real equality for everybody, a real voice for everybody, a real one person, one vote democracy. And if we dream about it and we envision it and we act for it, then we can make it happen. If we don't, it's never going to happen. So anyway, thank you. I'll finish with that. I hope to energize you and make you feel like there's hope, and at the same time realize that there's some very serious dangers out there that we have to do something about. And then if you want to ask me any more questions after this.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Miko, for this wonderful presentation. Before we started, I just want to give you possibly a few minutes to tell us about the transition. You grew up in Jerusalem, you didn't even know about any Palestinians, and somehow during your life you made that unbelievable transition. So if you just, people who didn't read your book, we have it available here after the lecture, but maybe for a few minutes tell how that transition was made. What made you realize what's going on?
Of course, yeah. So I was born and raised in a very Zionist family, a very patriotic Zionist family. In my family, I had my father who was a general and grandfather who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. I had a great uncle who was the president of the State of Israel, and so there was as patriotic and Israeli Zionist family as you could possibly imagine. So, and of course I grew up being very proud of that. When you grow up with a family like that, there's a great sense of pride. Because we created, the whole, I believe the myth completely. I was not only taught it in school, but I lived it and saw the people that created the myth every single day. Now, how do we change? What causes us to change is, of course, an interesting question. People always ask me, so what's the transformation? I usually say, well, you have to read the book. It's a long story. But to keep it short, sadly, the only thing I think that, at least from my experience, that causes great change in us, that causes us to change the way we view the world, that forces us to reflect on the things we truly believe are true, is a tragedy. It's something terrible. When something terrible happens, that usually shakes us and forces us to do that. Not always, but sadly I think that's, in many cases, that is the case. That is what happens. In my case, my sister's little girl, 13-year-old girl, was killed in a suicide attack in Jerusalem in 1997, September 1997. And that is exactly the kind of shock that forces one to take a close look and review everything you believe in and question it. I mean, what would possibly get 3 young, healthy men to blow themselves up and kill other people? I mean, it's a horrible thing. And then you see the terrible destruction that's left. So that forced me into a journey. The subtitle of my book is Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, into a journey into Palestine. And the journey into Palestine means a journey from the sphere of the occupier, the privileged, there's always electricity and there's always running water and the roads are always paved and it's very safe and clean, to the sphere where the others live. It's very, very different. They look different, they sound different, they speak different, they dress different, and the entire area of where Palestinians live is completely different. It looks different. And when I grew up in Jerusalem, there were no checkpoints. There was no wall. I mean, you could walk freely, but nobody would. Nobody in their right mind from where I grew up would go into a Palestinian neighborhood. The walls were solidly built and the checkpoints were solidly built in here. We didn't need a wall because Palestinians are dangerous and they hate us and they're irrational. And it's kind of dirty and dusty and it's just not somewhere we go because who knows what's going to happen. In fact, even today, when I travel up and down the country, even out of Palestinian communities, to see friends of mine in the West Bank, anywhere else in Mecca, Israelis that know me, even family members, say to me, "Are you sure it's safe? Are you sure you have to go? Well, are you sure it's safe?" It's so deeply ingrained. But then, having taken the journey, 2 things happened. Number one, I realized the vast differences that exist between the 2 communities. The vast injustice that exists, and I couldn't live with it. I couldn't accept it. I can't see a justification to the kind of injustice that exists there. It's not necessarily big. I mean, it is big things, but it's not things that people usually talk about, like water, for example. When you drive along the highways inside 1948 Palestine, a lot of times you're going to see Palestinian towns on one side of the highway, and either right next to them, across a road, or across the highway, you're going to see the Israeli settlements, the Israeli towns. And if you pay attention, you'll see that all the homes in the Palestinian towns have these great big black water tanks on the roofs. And none of the Israeli Jewish homes have that. And unless you ask the question why, it's not going to mean anything. But the reality is that Palestinians are allocated only 3% of the water in the country. All the water in the country is managed and governed by the Israeli Water Authority, Mekorot. You may have heard about it. It's also a topic of boycott BDS as well, because they sell themselves out there as, making the desert bloom. So Mekorot allocates 3%, you heard me right, of the water to the Palestinians throughout the entire country. Now, Palestinians are the majority in the entire country. Out of some 12 million people, there are about 7 million Palestinians. So Israeli Jews are the minority. So the Palestinians, again, I'll say this again, I hope this is shocking, we find this as shocking as I did, 3% of the water. So, if you have a family, and you're only going to get 10 or 12 or 20 hours of running water per week, then first of all, you need to store the water while it's available. Israelis don't have that issue. They don't even know about that there is an issue. I wouldn't even dream growing up of not having water in the tap. I don't know anybody who did. And so that is one of these things you don't realize unless you're in there and you're actually paying attention. So why do these have? And now I'm talking these big water tanks. I'm talking about Palestinians inside 1948 in communities where they are Israeli citizens. I'm not even talking about Gaza, for example, where it gets no clean water. I used to tell you about that. Where 98% of the water is not fit for drinking. 2.2 million people without water fit for drinking. And it's not because they live in some godforsaken place. They live 30 minutes from Tel Aviv, 5 minutes from Israeli towns where there's plenty of water and plenty of food and plenty of everything, electricity and medicine and everything. So these are the kinds of things that I realized as a result of this journey.
Did you have to go through soul searching?
Oh yes, a great deal of soul searching, because suddenly everything I knew and everything I learned from the people that I admired turned out to be a lie. It's like somebody cutting off your arm without anesthesia.
Did you try to confront anybody?
Oh, I confront people all the time. My father had already passed away, so I couldn't talk to him about this by the time all this happened. But I talk to people all the time, and then most of the time it's like talking to the wall. Because it's so deeply ingrained, people don't want to change.
We're going to open it up now, and we're going to take a few questions, and then you'll answer them all at once.
Yeah, okay.
All right. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this. But, I'm Palestinian, I'm from Gaza as well. But my question is that perhaps I misunderstood you, but correctly. Were you insinuating that these gangsters units actually were not supported by the government since the 1948 occupation of Palestine? Because there is a Arabic written version of the history that actually talks about this, and these gangsters or zealots actually were supported by the Israeli government from day one.
No, what I said was that they...
We're going to take all questions.
Oh, all the questions there,
Okay.
okay.
So we can allow. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm Abdullah, University of in Syria. My question was, as what you said about the PDS and about the boycotting, it's like not violence against Israel. So would it be, is there any other alternative? Because like, as you know, the PDS have been working on that, and the entire globe have been boycotting one way or another as possible they could have. But still you have in the country, you have Israel, which means, I mean, like they're so fast, they're doing everything so fast and quick. So is it really kind of realistic to have this fear only through the means of boycotting? Is it going to stop Israel? Or do we have any alternative?
All right, any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. So you mentioned the three demands of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel, and we all agree that they are simple, legitimate, and there is a huge consensus among the Palestinian society about them. Yet, if you look at the German parliament recently passing a resolution condemning the BDS movement as anti-Semitic. So how do we balance between, the three demands being realistic, legitimate, at the same time on a governmental level, globally, we have a movement of somehow dubbing the BDS movement as anti-Semitic and legitimate.
Can you identify yourself?
Yusuf Al-Jamal from Gaza.
Okay, please identify yourself when you ask the question if you can. Okay, any others? Yes?
My name is Elena Alshawa. I'm Turkish, married to a Palestinian. I visited Jerusalem one time with my children, and we were saying that Jerusalem is presented as being a mixed city, and they always have those in the media that Israel is the only democracy in the region. And how can they sell this argument while even the license plates are different? There is even segregation to the point that the Palestinian, the 1948 Israeli citizens and Palestinians are given different license plates to their cars, that they cannot just freely go to any place or park their cars in any place, to that point that there is segregation. How can they promote this idea that they are so democratic in especially to the United States, that they are receiving all this aid from them?
Thank you. Any other questions? One more question before we can turn it. Okay, go second round. Yes.
My name is Abdurrahman. Real simple question. Now, given all the successes the occupation has had throughout history, what would you think the case will be with the deal of the century, and how far will it go?
Okay, so we got 5 questions.
Okay.
First one was about the gangsters.
Yeah, I got it. No. Yeah, no, but what I said about those zealots, about those gangsters, not that the government didn't support them, they pretended to distance themselves at first. Then, because they were already there, the government was in a position, well, we have to protect them. We have to give them water. We have to give them electricity. We can't just ignore them. We have to protect them from the Arabs. And that's how they, ended up supporting them, as though they were forced into it, as though they had no choice, But of course they supported them. They were ideologically, they spearheaded the Zionist project. And there's so many different examples of that, both from 1948 and then also after 1967 and West Bank. No, absolutely, they supported it. Now, is it realistic to expect that BDS will be a success? It's only as realistic as we make it. It's like when people ask, when will Palestine be free? Well, it depends on how hard we work. It's not going to be an act of God, that's for sure. It's going to depend on us. So will BDS be successful? Could it be more successful? Of course it could be more successful. It's going at a pace that's remarkable, considering how few people are actually involved. If more people were involved, you can imagine the kind of success we would have. But it's a very small group of people that's actually doing things, that are actually involved in campaigns and so forth. And it's a very, very, very tough battle because you're facing, Elbit, which is this enormous Israeli conglomerate that manufactures and sells weapons everywhere to everyone. Some of the worst weapons in the world, and we're talking about billions and billions of dollars of industry. We're talking about HP and boycotting HP. These are enormous tasks. So can they succeed? Of course they can succeed, but they're only going to succeed as much as we participate in them, as much as we support them, as much as we become a part of them.
We have a follow-up on that.
Yeah.
If we look at if the goal, as you stated, it eventually will dismantle all Zionist institutions, will BDS be able on its own do it, or do you see this as a supplement to something else?
Well, it's never one thing, obviously. No revolution succeeds as a result of one thing. I think it's like a Parthenon. You have that. You've got the popular resistance in Palestine. You've got groups that do armed resistance. It's a whole range of things that's working together. But I think in terms of what we do on the outside, that's probably the most effective thing we can do. And again, expanding on that, it's not just us, but we have elected officials that we can influence and make sure that they act, in a way that promotes this. We make sure that they do not visit Israel. We make sure that, or we try to get to a point where governments send away the Israeli ambassadors, send them back. Why is there an Israeli ambassador, here in Turkey? There shouldn't be one, and vice versa, or like the South Africans did, which is to downgrade the diplomatic mission, things like that. It comes to mind. Just one more thing. We're talking about the deal of the century. The Palestinian mission in Washington D.C. was closed. The Palestinian mission in Washington D.C. was a PLO mission, really, but it was really the only Palestinian official representation, on the anniversary of the Oslo Accords, almost to the day. 25th anniversary of the Oslo Accords. They closed down, and they literally kicked out the head of the mission, the ambassador and his family. Literally kicked them out, took the kids out of school, and now he's the head of mission in London. But so several things. First of all, they did it on the anniversary of Oslo, which is something I'm sure Netanyahu was very happy about. He was smiling the whole time, I'm sure. Number two, it says there is no legitimacy to any Palestinian claim to self-determination, so there's no need for a Palestinian entity in Washington, D.C. So the fact that there is or isn't a diplomatic mission reflects our accepting the legitimacy of their claim to self-determination. So if we don't recognize the legitimacy of Israel, there shouldn't be an ambassador. And there shouldn't be an embassy. And vice versa, there shouldn't be an ambassador in Tel Aviv either. So these are this is how it grows. This is how we act. It's not just that we don't buy an avocado that's grown in Israel or an orange. It's that we talk to our elected officials, we talk to people of influence, we talk to universities, we make sure there are no collaborations and so forth. That is how we do it. We make sure that our governments don't do business with Israel, don't buy arms from Israel, which is a big tough one. That's a tough one. That's billions of dollars. But if we do all participate, if we do all organize, if we do all take part, then of course it's going to be much faster. So the success depends on us. You know, it's like a wounded person on the ground. If we walk by and say, "Hey, good luck," it's not going to help. If we do something to stop the bleeding, now we're helping. Palestine needs us now to stop the bleeding, actively, with our hands, stop the bleeding.
Walk us through the Israeli mind.
Sorry?
Walk us through the Israeli mind when it comes to BDS. How do the Israeli public, I mean, eventually, if we take this to the ultimate, how would that work within the Israel? Would they back off, or would it be more, we need to crush them more?
No, they will fight it. They will fight it more and more and more and more and more. Because to them, it's the way you were raised as an Israeli is the world is always against us because they're anti-Semitic. The Palestinians are anti-Semitic because they're Arabs and they want our land, and these people are anti-Semitic because of this, and everybody's against us. And BDS is it's just one more aspect of anti-Semitism, and there's no legitimacy to it. So, for example, there was a big I went in, I came in as a participant, not as an observer, at this big conference that they had in Jerusalem a couple years ago, how to fight the BDS. It was massive. All the public officials there, elected officials, Mossad, everybody was there. Journalists, Jewish millionaires from America. How do we fight this thing? One person out of all the people that were presenting there dared to say the word occupation. One person. It was the ambassador of the European Union in Tel Aviv. He dared to say on a panel that maybe some of the call for BDS has to do with the occupation. And there were probably 6,000 people in the audience booing him. How dare he say occupation? We do nothing wrong. We did nothing wrong. It's all about anti-Semitism. So that's the frame. That's the frame of mind. That's how they're thinking.
German parliament against BDS?
Yeah, well, I think so. This is nothing new. I mean, this has been going on in Europe. It's been going on in the U.S. Local governments, local governments delegitimizing the call for boycott, saying it's anti-Semitic and so forth. So in the United States, for example, state by state, many different states, over 30 states, I think, have already passed laws that make it illegal to call for a boycott against Israel. In some cases, they create a reality where if you seek employment with the government, you have to sign a note that says you promise not to support boycott of Israel. Most people don't even know what boycott is or Israel is, so they don't care. But from time to time, like in one case in Texas, there was a Palestinian who said, absolutely not, I'm not signing this, and she was a speech therapist or something. So it became a big deal. And every time it went to court, every time it was challenged in court, it was, the courts always ruled that it is unconstitutional. You cannot tell people not to boycott. Boycott is free speech. So every time it went to court in the United States, every single time, the other side lost, because the courts are saying, what are you talking about? Boycotting, people should be allowed to boycott. And even it came to a point where in January, the new Senate was talking about a new bill that they were going to, that they were voting on, and part of the bill talked about this thing where boycotting Israel should be deemed illegal because it's anti-Semitic. And senators who are 1,000% supporters of Israel said, we can't vote for this. It's too far. We can't tell our people not to boycott, it's unconstitutional. So even senators who support Israel didn't vote for this, which I think is a very good thing, and explain why they didn't do it. So in a way, I think this creates a lot of conversation. It creates debate. And I think it's actually working in our favor. I think in the case of Germany, it is so cynical that it's beyond belief. Because Germany took anti-Semitism to a level that nobody has ever done before. So they know exactly what it is because they did it. And to equate BDS, which is a call for justice, a call for freedom, a call for equality, with what they did to Jews, you have to have the kind of audacity that is beyond belief. I mean, I don't know how these members of the Bundestag that voted for this can look at themselves in the mirror. The shame. After what the Germans did, how the levels of anti-Semitism they reached, so they know what it is. And Germans learn about the Holocaust. They learn about anti-Semitism all day long. And they say that this is anti-Semitism? You have to be so cynical, such a hypocrite, that is a whole new level of cynicism that I think should be. And one day, and I tweeted as soon as this happened, I said, these people should be shamed. And when this is over and when they're retired, they should be found and shamed again and again and again for daring to compare the Palestinian call for justice and freedom to what they did to Jews. That is not something that can be forgiven. That is not something that can be forgotten. It's almost as though they are the ones dropping the bombs on Gaza. That severe.
Next question is about how could they sell, the Israelis could sell, especially the Americans, the existence of...
Well, to sell it to the Americans is very easy. Because the Americans have been doing the exact same thing, only longer and bigger. They talk about shared values between America and Israel. Well, they share the same values. It's genocide, it's racism, it's making money off of selling weapons. They share the values, so it's a very easy sell, actually, to America. It's white supremacy. These are things that Americans, look who they voted for president. So, that is a very easy sell. The same thing in Europe. It's very, very easy to sell racism to racists, to sell violence to people who promoted violence that are, even longer, even before the Zionists were even born. So it's not a tough sell at all. You just sell the lies and you add a little bit of Bible and you add a little bit of religion and you add a little bit of God and boom, they know what they're doing, and they've also been doing this for a very long time. I have a poster at home that advertises a lecture by my grandfather in 1920. I think it's in Kiev or somewhere, where he's out there promoting Zionism to Jews and asking rich Jews to pay and asking young Jews to come to the land of Israel. They've been doing this, they've been selling this, they've been lobbying for this for more than 100 years. They're very good at it. They know how to use the language, they know how to do this. They're very good, and they've got a lot of experience, and that's sometimes all it takes. Marketing, you can market anything if you know how to do it. If you know how to do it well.
Last question.
Well, I think the deal of the century is not going to go far at all. I think the deal of the century is concocted by three ambitious, megalomaniac fools, and they're all going to fall on their face because there's nothing about it that's realistic. New Palestine, we call Palestine New Palestine, to create this nothingness for Palestinians, to allow Israel to take everything, and absolutely everything, and Palestinians are left with absolutely nothing. There are 5.5 million refugees in refugee camps. You can say all day long that they're not refugees. They are refugees in their refugee camps, and their homes are back in Palestine. You can say that the Palestinians marching in Gaza are just terrorists and they're trying to, come through illegally through an international. It's not true, because their homes and their lands and their rights and their water are on the other side of the concentration camp that they built. And in this case, calling it a concentration camp is a good comparison, because it's exactly what it is. And we compare what was done in concentration camps by the Germans, what was being done in that concentration camp, the calorie count, the lack of water, food, and so on. There's room for comparison there. So there's nothing about it that could possibly work. It's ambitious, and these are a bunch of young megalomaniacs who think they can just make people disappear and give countries to people and make Jerusalem Jewish or something. I think it's going to fall on its face very, very fast. Nothing is going to come out of it. Absolutely nothing. And it's going to be I don't think it's going to last. Even the discussions are not going to last very long. Absolutely not.
The very last question, now that you've become a voice throughout the world about Palestinian rights being very, very hard critic of Israel, how does your immediate family, those who are close to you, who know you personally, how do they react? Do they get shaken up? Do they get affected by that?
Well, my immediate family mostly agrees with me on most things. Mostly agrees, not everybody agrees on everything, but mostly agrees with me on all things, and they respect what I do. But it's, so that's kind of, that's the kind of the fine line. That's the reality in which in which it all exists. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, we have some books that people can sign if you're interested in these books. How many?
And also,